Climate change is never far from the headlines. It's as topical as it is divisive.
Right now, we're facing a man-made disaster of global scale. Our greatest threat in thousands of years. Climate change.
Climate change.
Climate change.
Climate change.
People are so arrogant to think they can change climate.
Climate change is already in our backyard.
Official 2012 was the hottest year in the United States.
It's 2014.
2015.
Warmest year around the world.
Warmest year on record.
It is his activities which drove mankind out of the Garden of Eden.
Kia ora, I'm Amanda Gillies, and on The Detail today, climate change. But this time we're going to zero in on a controversial possible answer to stopping or slowing climate change in New Zealand. It's called carbon capture and storage, or CCS.
The practice of removing carbon dioxide emitted from industrial processes and injecting it into the ground.
It's a technology that's been around for about 50 years, separating carbon dioxide from oil and gas when it's extracted and injecting it into depleted oil and gas reservoirs. It's a critical part of the government's plan for climate success and to meet its legal obligations to cut emissions by 2030. But is it really a viable solution, or simply an expensive distraction?
Energy analysts say New Zealand is at risk of investing in a carbon removal strategy that is expensive and ineffective instead of investing in measures that will actually reduce emissions.
Well, carbon capture is a high priority for businesses that would otherwise have to pay for their emissions under the emissions trading scheme.
It's had 50 years and it's failed to live up to any of the promises.
To get to the bottom of this, today I talked to RNZ's climate change correspondent Eloise Gibson about carbon capture and storage, how it works and if it does work, and when it will start in New Zealand, if at all.
There are different types, but the type we are talking about in New Zealand is catching carbon dioxide out of the air, or even before it reaches the air, and condensing it, squishing it right down, and putting it away somewhere, hopefully forever, usually into a reservoir underground, some type of geological formation, and in a very neat turn of events, sometimes putting it back into the exact same geological reservoir that the oil and gas that made a whole bunch of carbon emissions came from in the first place. So, we've spent over 100 years now taking fossil fuels out of underground fissures and burning them and heating up the planet. This process tries to put that into reverse, put them away where they can't make things hotter.
So basically you bury it underground forever, is that correct?
That is the hope. Naturally, there are all kinds of debates about what happens if these reservoirs leak. Who is liable? How long should the liability go for before inevitably the government takes over the responsibility for any cleanup? And there are all kinds of people researching what are the safest ways to do this? What are the safest places to put it? It seems so far that one of the lowest risk, not zero risk, but lowest risk options is to tuck it away in reservoirs that have already had fossil fuels in them and that are now kind of depleted because they've already held, liquid fossil fuel for perhaps thousands of years. And the hope is that if you pumped it back in there, it would stay there. But suffice to say, plenty of debate going on about whether you can trust that process to stay there forever. Obviously, a better option would be not to pump it into the atmosphere in the first place. Then there's no risk. But we're not doing that quickly enough. So other options like this are being looked at.
Is this viable, or people keep saying it's just a sort of a shiny distraction while emissions keep rising?
Shiny distraction is a very good phrase, and I think it's both. So this is not a stupid idea. And if you look at the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, when all of the boffins put their heads together and crunch the numbers, they say that if we want to keep the planet in that most livable zone possible, 1.5 to 2 degrees hotter than it used to be, we're going to need to do some of this. We're going to need to suck a bunch of the carbon dioxide that we've already pumped out of the air and put it somewhere. Now, trees obviously already do this. They're not doing it enough. So it is kind of an all hands to the pump scenario. I think where a lot of people will agree that this will be needed is for some of the activities that are really hard to decarbonise. So not me and you driving our car. We know how to fix that. It's actually not that expensive to change burning fossil fuel to get around for transport. But there are some really niche industrial processes that there aren't kind of affordable or straightforward ways to decarbonise and may still not be in 10, 20, 30 years. So the niche that this seems likely to have, the best niche for it seems to be to tackle those emissions, to offset those emissions, if we decide we want to keep doing those activities. The reason, though, that people call it a shiny distraction is also valid, and that's because there's something of a trust issue here, and that is that a lot of the companies that are promoting this the loudest globally are fossil fuel companies, often the likes of Chevron, say, which until recently, or, ExxonMobil was saying climate change isn't even a thing. It's not even a problem. And if it is a problem, well, it's probably fine. And then, oh, yes, look, it is a problem. And look, here's a shiny thing that we happen to be the best industry suited to receive a whole lot of government funding to progress. And there is, I think, probably a reasonable fear that governments will get distracted and think, well, gosh, acting on emissions at the source is hard and people don't like it when we change things. Maybe we'll just suck them all back up and everything will be fine. The reality is that a lot of these projects overseas that have been done already have underperformed what they promised. They've only stored, a bit of what they said.
In Western Australia, a much touted carbon capture project has failed to reach its promised storage level since it started operating in 2019.
Back in 2004, we here at the Australian Institute didn't think CCS would be a goer, and the latest research shows that we were right then and we're right now. It's time to say it for what it is. Carbon capture and storage is a scam, and it's used by mining companies to excuse them opening new mines and new gas fields.
And if you add them all together, it's still, 0.00 something % of the emissions that these fossil fuel companies are putting out in the first place. So it's certainly not the solution, but it could be a bit of the solution. I think the question that we're hashing out around the world and now in New Zealand is what is the appropriate time and place, and I guess trying to make sure that we don't get distracted from just not putting the emissions out there to start with if we can help it.
Yeah, because New Zealand is finally trying to launch its first CCS project. Where are we at with this at the moment, and sort of why now?
Well, we have a coalition government that wants to seek the most affordable ways to cut carbon dioxide, and that doesn't really want to do it with subsidies. So its starting point is that anything you can do in a market, the emissions trading scheme in the case of New Zealand, is going to find the cheapest options, and that it will take as hands-off an approach as possible. So its approach generally in renewable energy and here is to say, well, we'll try and make it possible for things to happen, but we won't subsidise or do them ourselves. The projections, though, show that that's perhaps not quite going to get us there in terms of cutting emissions enough. So one thing that the government said was, well, look, if companies want to do carbon capture and storage, we don't want to stand in their way. We will have a regime so that, you can be allowed to do this if it stacks up for you financially. Things got a bit exciting when they were crunching the numbers on their emissions reduction plan, because officials were going around and talking to companies about, do you want to do this? When do you think you might do it? Is it feasible? And they were confident enough that we'd get one project at the Kapuni gas field over the line in about 2027 that they wrote it into their emissions reduction plan. The problem is that they didn't have a regulatory regime in place to do it then. And when they started doing the regulation, companies kind of started to get a bit nervous and said, look, actually, carbon price is lower than we thought it was going to be. we're not going to get paid enough to do this if you're just paying us by the tonne for the carbon that we put underground in a marketplace. We actually need some more intervention from you to make this worthwhile. And that's left the government in a bit of a conundrum. I should say that we haven't got the rules yet, but the government has given some hints about what it will look like, and it is modelled pretty closely on what countries like Australia are already doing.
So to get the project back on track in Taranaki, she says Todd Energy basically needs more money or less liability, or a combination of both.
There's a whole raft of things that have changed. One is that the carbon price is low compared to other countries. It's certainly a lot lower than the costs that emissions impose on society. And because the true cost of carbon isn't reflected in the carbon price, it's less than $50. And this, at least for the first little while companies get used to doing this, it's going to be expensive. It's going to be expensive to set up. And so that is one issue. But there's also the issue of things like the liability regime. So if there's a leak 15 years after you fill up a field and close it off, who is responsible for that? If there's a leak in 50 years, who's responsible for that? You can imagine that those aren't direct cash subsidies, but if the government agrees to take more of that burden, it's kind of an implicit subsidy for this type of thing. So there's a bunch of wrangling going on around the rules. And of course, the government having written, not named the Kapuni gas field, but written what is essentially a model of what Kapuni could do into its entire emissions reduction plan, has left it a wee bit vulnerable. Because if the likes of Todd Energy now turn around and say, we're not going to do this, the government has a hole in its plan and has to figure out how else to cut emissions. So, there is some strategic negotiating going on, I imagine, here. And also, of course, officials are involved in looking at what other regimes have done and thinking, what is an acceptable risk for the public to take here? How much do people want to be left carrying the can if this goes underground and then starts to leak? How big is the risk of that happening? What should companies have to prove before they're allowed to start? All those things you can imagine impact on the cost beyond just, a cash handout or something like that.
Have people like in the surrounding areas, farmers, iwis, sort of everyday Kiwis, have they been properly consulted on this, do you know?
I don't know, and I suspect that it would happen when there was a proposal drawn up. At the moment, we're in the feasibility study phase, so it's geologists looking at rock formations and oil and gas engineers thinking about the logistics and the cost of all of this stuff. How do you compress it? How does it all work? But until there is a proposal that's kind of commercial and likely to happen at a particular time, I can't imagine that there's any requirement to go out and consult the community. Interestingly, I was listening to a podcast about some of the overseas communities that live above these fields, and there has been some controversy because, of course, the industry would say it's not very likely that these are going to leak, particularly if you put them in the right place. But if you put them in the wrong place, a hit of carbon dioxide at really high concentrations coming out near you is not going to be very nice. So they have to think about things like, is the area earthquake prone? How porous is the geological situation?
Time-lapse photos show the liquefied gas spreading out through the rock. It's constantly monitored for one big unknown.
Obviously, we do not want to cause any man-made earthquakes to happen.
So far, there's been no major carbon injection-induced activity in Canada.
While in Norway, geological movement meant a project had to be suspended.
And you can imagine that as this becomes more common around the world, those conversations with communities are going to become quite fraught in the same way that they do with other big energy projects.
You just mentioned earthquakes. New Zealand is prone to earthquakes. How safe does that make us to have a CCS in New Zealand?
Yes, my understanding is that it varies by region and fault line, but I'm not an expert enough. I haven't read up on it enough to know, but I do know that scoping has been done that has been suggested that there are places where it could be safe or could work. On the other hand, gas fields off the shore and on the shore of Taranaki have been there for a really long time. And so presumably that that material has stayed safe in these reservoirs for thousands of years, despite us being a shaky place. So, yeah, I think this is all the stuff that would be nutted out as part of any project, and probably part of what the government is considering at the moment. You know, what things do you need to tick off for us to feel safe saying, yep, you can pump a whole bunch of liquefied CO2 underground?
Now, obviously, you've done a big piece on this and written about it. What has the government response been to that? What have they been saying to you? Is there any response?
I went to the Minister, Simon Watts, before I wrote that piece to say, look, if this project doesn't go ahead, what is going to happen to your emissions reduction plan? You've leaned on this for a third of your savings, and it's a big part of the basis for your government saying, we do take emissions budgets seriously and we're going to meet our obligations. Look, we're on track. He didn't answer directly what would replace this. He did stress that the government takes what they call an adaptive approach with their emissions budgets, which I guess means they can pivot if something doesn't pan out. But given that they have cut a whole bunch of Labour-era policies that could have given them about 1 million tonnes of savings, which is what they need if this falls over, they're not likely to start those up again. And there's absolutely nothing on the table that I've seen that would fill that gap that this government would support. So it does give them a problem. I also asked, of course, would you give subsidies for this? And again, didn't get a direct answer to that. All the minister said was, we are still considering the regime. So not a yes, not a no. We know that Shane Jones in New Zealand First perhaps keener on subsidising the fossil fuel industry to explore for oil and gas, and would probably very open to supporting them to do this as well. But the national part of the government has been a lot more wary of any kind of subsidy, and kind of says quite frequently that it's energy agnostic. You know, it doesn't support one horse or the other in the race, and that it doesn't support one form of climate action over another, which is its reason for not giving subsidies for things like companies getting off coal. So if its whole kind of rationale is letting the market find the most efficient solution, and the market is saying the carbon price isn't high enough to do this, arguably, you know, to be consistent, they'd have to say, well, it shouldn't happen. It's just not affordable. So it's a real conundrum between, you know, the government having committed to these climate targets, but also being not keen on spending a bunch of money and trying to get money from wherever it can, cutting programs to pay for tax cuts and things like that. So a very interesting kind of situation that the government finds itself in, and it's not clear at all what its plan is.
When it comes to climate change and fighting climate change in 2025, is it a vote winner for the government or not? Are they just going, oh, well, actually, you know, just push that under the carpet a little bit?
It's interesting that the government certainly does seem quite frozen on climate change. It seems frozen in that it doesn't appear to think it can renege on its promises to live up to the Paris Agreement and things like that. But it also seems frozen in that it doesn't appear to want to spend any money or intervene in society at all. And it's quite hard to do both. So I don't know what their internal thinking is on this. However, we do, at least in New Zealand, have a consensus across the two main parties that, you know, the Climate Change Response Act needs to stay, the Emissions Trading Scheme needs to stay, and that Paris targets are non-negotiable, although we do also have a situation where we're about 80 million tonnes short of our 2030 target under any scenario, and no plan to fill that.
The second emissions reduction plan shows New Zealand is on track to meet domestic goals for 2030, but still 84 million tonnes off meeting our international target under the Paris Agreement. For context, New Zealand emits about 77 million tonnes a year.
Our plan shows that we can meet climate targets while still supporting a thriving economy.
So whether the government is kind of hoping to wait out its time and hope that nobody will notice is an open question.
Trump, he's obviously pulled out of the Paris Agreement.
The next item here is the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Treaty.
That was the moment President Trump withdrew the U.S. from the Paris Climate Agreement, a worldwide pact that aims to fight global warming.
Whatever our government is doing, Trump is now doing the opposite to kickstart his economy by getting America more energy and cheaper.
And we have something that no other manufacturing nation will ever have, the largest amount of oil and gas of any country on earth, and we are going to use it. We will be a rich nation again, and it is that liquid gold under our feet that will help to do it.
What sort of influence and role does he have now when it comes to fighting climate change, do you think?
The president isn't the be-all and end-all. Trump has pulled the US out of the Paris Agreement before, the last time he was president. That time, nobody followed him. This time, again, no one has followed him. So I think the global consensus still remains what it is. But it's not to say that it doesn't matter. But a very interesting trend that we have seen is that the big global corporates that are headquartered in the United States, of course, they have clever people who do forecasts about what climate change is going to cost them and what consumer markets around the world who are buying their products want. And they seem to be reading the tea leaves and deciding that actually they do still need to keep moving. And so there is more momentum in the system than you might think. On the other hand, the cuts to things like climate science have an impact around the globe because we have these really long-running records of the global climate, of oceans, of atmosphere, and historically the United States has been a science leader. It's had a really well-resourced, incredibly highly skilled science system that the rest of the world has to some extent leaned on. And those are being cut. You know, there are records that have been kept for decades and decades that researchers all over the show rely on that are now going to have a break in them, no matter what happens in the next United States election. So that kind of undermining of our capacity to understand the climate, which is such a complex system and so important to our lives, I think that's going to have a huge impact.
Back here to the underground storage and overhead doubts, what is the cost?
Well, so far it's not costing taxpayers anything, other than maybe a few studies, that might have been supported with government funds, but they haven't, it hasn't been huge. If there were to be a subsidy, that would be different, and that will be a really interesting debate to watch. Certainly at the moment, it's not the cheapest way to reduce emissions. I think that the very fact that these companies are saying this is not economic for us is telling you that there are cheaper ways to get emissions under control today. And certainly we know, there's a ton of things we could do in transport and other areas of the economy, industry that actually would help companies who are being caught in the gas crisis to keep producing and would probably be cheaper. That would be economic at today's ETS prices. So this is not going to be the cheapest cab off the rank. On the other hand, I hear scientists overseas say, well, look, at some point we are going to need to do this. And it wouldn't hurt actually to get a pilot project running so that when push comes to shove and say 2030, 2040, and we've got these really difficult emissions that we just can't get rid of, we know how to do it and we know it works. So kind of back to that thing, I guess, if it's not a bad idea, it's just how you fund it and when you do it.
With everything you know and written about and researched, realistically, are we going to have anything in New Zealand anytime soon?
No, I don't think so. I hope that we get to use everything in the toolbox. I don't think this is a time to be ruling out solutions, but it's also not a time to be distracted by expensive solutions when we have other stuff that we know works right there. So I hope it doesn't become a distraction. I think that we are going to end up doing it at some point. But at this point, having read the submissions from the various companies on the government's regulatory plans, it just doesn't seem like it's going to happen in the next 4.5 years before 2030. Maybe after that, but I can't see it happening at a scale that's going to take the pressure off in terms of having to cut our emissions. It's going to be one of the things in the Swiss Army knife, I hope, but we're not going to be popping it out in the next couple of years.
That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to Eloise Gibson. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by Phil Benge. I'm Amanda Gillies. Mā te wā.